All right, so this is Sociology of the Mundane and Boredom in the House, episode 1. We have me, host of the Single podcast today, AJ, and co-host
Percy.
And so today specifically, all we're really talking about is going to be the past, present, and potentially future context of which that people engage with the house and housework and the home, just because we understand that these differences and disparities in terms of how and the types of people that engage with it tend to be very varied. And so if we are to draw necessary conclusions based off of the readings that we were provided, and one of which that I found, then I think that it'll actually help provide very wonderful insight into what relationships to the home may end up being like in the future. And so one of the initial texts that I ended up finding would be Wages Against Housework by Federici. Just in general, I felt as though the text did a really good job of establishing the groundwork of which that we could, through a feminist lens, analyze the relationships to work in the house and labor. And I just think that she did a really good job in this reading of talking a lot about how, due to housework being described as a labor of love, that there was a lot of undertones and explicit sentiments towards it not actually demanding compensation in the same general sense that like the kind of work a man would do would end up receiving and getting. And I guess I just really enjoyed the fact that it establishes how housework in and of itself was more of an inescapable obligation for women rather than some kind of some kind of work that was worthy of fair and proper consideration. And I think that ends up really well establishing that this form of essentially holding women to this hyper-specific, even to a very large degree bioessentialized adheration to child rearing, dishes,
even the space
cooking,
of the household.
even maintaining the space.
Not being able to leave, because if you're not going to work, you're not really going anywhere. You're here for that particular job that's not recognized as a job.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that is exactly how it actually really well intersects with the second text, Just Like One of the Family by Sarah Joffe, just because I felt like I really enjoyed her text a little bit more, just because it went into much more in depth about the complexities of how not only was it a sexist gendered aspect, but even racialized to a very large extent, because a lot of these workers, house workers, these nannies, these maids, these mammies, whatever they ended up being called at the time, these kinds of labors were outsourced to typically minority or disenfranchised women, just because, hey, if like the housewife couldn't keep up with those chores or those duties, it was just so much easier to find that labor elsewhere.
That they were already pre-entitled to due to the historical context of like slavery and everything.
Exactly, which they were already relatively entitled to due to the historical context of slavery, which I felt as though this text also went in. So that does bring us on to the next portion of the podcast. Now that we've kind of established what the initial two texts end up doing in regards to just kind of creating that historical context, that historical foundation that we're going to operate off of housework not being compensated, it being bioessentialized to not just womanhood, but also even racialized identities, I guess I would like to immediately talk about how I feel that this all relates to the third text, which is It Gets Really Boring If You Stay at Home by Asiya Islam. And I guess I just really enjoyed this text because it talks a lot about how there's a very intrinsic mental state that is associated with work and with labor, and that we do need to actually immediately recognize it through a gendered lens in order to not be short-sighted within our broader depictions or descriptions of what we feel society is experiencing. Like we need to address the fact that women's connection and relation to the home has always been very oppositionally different to what it has been for men over many and multiple years and decades. And so this text in particular, I feel, does a really good job of kind of making it clear how in the prior two texts that this relationship to work is not only being very heavily shifted by changing material circumstances that a lot of women are experiencing. In this particular text, it was Delhi, India. but it also can provide us wonderful insight into what exactly the future may hold in regards to all of our relationships to the house, considering the changing tides that we're also seeing within our modern society.
Seeing with temporal disillusion,
Disruption.
seeing with temporal disruption, and how men feel like they go home to get away from work while women are at the home thinking about going to work because that's what would elevate a woman. Meanwhile, a man doesn't know what he would have if he wasn't already working and providing, especially now with how most people can't really do anything in their economies.
Yeah, and I guess I really like that you brought that up because I feel like that actually very well segues into talking about what even is temporal disruption or disturbances in one's temporality. And essentially, all that's really talking about within this text in particular is about how people's relationships to work tend to be very self affirming, very gender affirming. And so we can actually look at how these inabilities to live up to these proposed standards for labor tend to cause a lot of internal disturbances or a temporal disruption, something generally very intangible but also very immediately impactful on how comfortable one feels within their own skin and how one engages with the world around them. And within this text in particular, it just talked a lot explicitly about how in New Delhi, India, as they're experiencing a lot of this rise in neoliberalism and the ability for women to actually finally leave the house and go to work and come home without having the same kind of like burdens and shackles to this housework and whatever that may entail, that there's a temporal disturbance that can also pretty immediately come from the inability to live up to those like other more neoliberal standards in a certain regard. In this text in particular, it specifically stated that not the work, but within this new realm of labor within Delhi, India, that a lot of women end up finding themselves actually more so bored at the house and waiting in this sort of dead time. And I feel
until they get like married and everything.
Yeah, until they get either married or until they end up finding work. And I feel as though that does a really good job of establishing how oftentimes boredom seems to be very intrinsically linked to this feeling of there being something other or something out there.
Productivity, you know?
Something productive that they could end up working towards. And that this is a very inverted relationship to the temporal disruption that men oftentimes feel. Men, of course, actually more so feeling as though, especially as times have gotten financially a lot harder, and that women have spent a lot more time receiving their, their rightful considerations and going out and getting work and getting education, that they are now forced to end up taking up a role that is very different from what they expected for themselves as like the breadwinner with some sort of absolute power. And I feel as though all three of those texts, both the Federici and the Sarah Joff text explaining why it is that these things initially ended up happening or being these relationships to the house ended up being formed, mixed with the recently discussed text, I feel that we can now, of course, go into where we feel that is going to lead us down within our own American society.
In a side note, I actually feel very interested by the article that takes place in Delhi, India, because it's women searching for labor instead of searching to be inside the home, which I think is interesting because Black women are having their own movements in their femininity to revert backwards, where it's like, yeah, I've been working my whole life, and so now it's time for me to be taken care of and to be put in home. It's a really big fight with femininity, you know?
Yeah, I guess it's really hard to separate labor from the gender prescribed values that one is supposed to now have due to their relationship to that labor. And I like seeing the ways in which, like you brought up, it can end up breaching cultural lines and how we can end up using that understanding to kind of further our predictions of what these engagements with relationships to the house are going to look like.
And now we see black men trying to strive to be the breadwinner after the oppression that they've constantly faced and everything.
This is very true.
So traditionalism for the black household.
Yes, I would definitely say so. And so I guess to kind of, officially bring it full circle and kind of more so like wrap up with what I feel my predictions are for the future, I guess I personally feel as though relationships to the home are going to be essentially relatively inverted, but with like a lot of immediate contention. I really like the fact that within the modern era of things, with how women are at this point becoming far more educated, higher educated, college educated than men, along with how they are out getting far more jobs and putting themselves in these positions to make this money, that now gives them the immediate freedom to engage with the home very differently and view it more so as a place of like genuine refuge, as opposed to the place of like somewhat always clouded over obligation that you have like existentially.
It also really gender neutralizes domestic work, because if women can be independent because they bring in their own sort of capital, they're working for themselves, they clean up after themselves, thinking about themselves, but that means men otherwise, especially with a loneliness epidemic, also have to strive to do that domestic work and come to do women's work and change overall.
Yeah, I would definitely say so. I guess that that really does a good job of immediately covering the aspect of what it'll be like on men's ends of things, since once again we kind of have to look at this through two very specific gender lenses, since the relationships to the home have never been the same for both genders anyway. I like the fact that whilst it is providing a place of freedom and or using it as genuine refuge for the women that are now, getting their education and getting their work, and now kind of creating that space to be a lot less temporally disturbed. I think men, however, are going to be much more temporally disturbed over the course of them essentially making this shift into caring for the house a lot more. It's just, if you're not actually the breadwinner that's making all of the money necessary in order to support your household and in order to support your wife and kids, then you very intrinsically kind of have to give up a lot of that power that came with being a man within these circumstances, which I feel is not only going to cause them to pretty immediately experience a lot of the temporal disruptions and disturbances that was talked about within the Islam text, but I also think that it's going to be, I guess, very enlightening in other senses. I feel as though it's one of those deals where everyone is going to come out very improved from it, but not until after they look past the fact that these gendered ways of looking at the house are immediately getting in the way of their ability to be comfortable within that house.
And won't be very frictionless as we see a rise or a push for traditionalism, back to that entitlement.
Yes, exactly. Back to that entitlement specifically. It just kind of seems as though within the modern times that the relationship to the house is going to be essentially inverted for both men and women receiving that, in many regards, I would say temporal alleviation, and men really more so experiencing that temporal disruption due to the fact that they have this increase in responsibilities and, lack of a maid that they expected to have and were told they deserve.